On a warm August night in 1965, a brand new jetliner, one of the most modern aircraft in the world, barely 10 weeks old, came gliding down through the darkness toward Chicago, descending smoothly, steadily, exactly as though everything were perfectly normal. The pilots had been cleared to level off at 6,000 feet. They acknowledged the instruction. "The captain," said Roger. And then the aeroplane kept descending, straight through 6,000 feet, straight down through the night, at a calm and unhurried 2,000 feet per minute, down past 4,000, down past 2,000, down toward the black and invisible surface of Lake Michigan, which none of them could see. There was no emergency call, no sign of struggle, no hint that anyone aboard knew anything was wrong. 60 years later, we still do not know with certainty why. This is the story of United Air Lines Flight 389, the first Boeing 727 ever lost, a crew who flew a flawless aeroplane into the water on a clear routine descent, and one of the most quietly haunting unsolved mysteries in the history of American aviation. On the 16th of August, 1965, a United Air Lines Boeing 727, descending toward Chicago at the end of a routine evening flight from New York, flew straight into Lake Michigan and was destroyed, killing all 30 people aboard. There was no mechanical failure anyone could find. There was no emergency, no distress call, no evidence of any struggle in the cockpit. The aircraft was practically new. The crew were experienced. The weather was not particularly bad, and the descent, right up until the moment it struck the water, appeared entirely ordinary. And when the investigators of the Civil Aeronautics Board had finished sifting through everything they could recover, which was not much, because the most important piece was lost forever at the bottom of the lake, they were forced to write one of the most unsatisfying sentences an accident report can contain, that they were unable to determine why the aeroplane had not stopped descending. This is a story without a firm ending, a genuine cold case in a field that prides itself on always finding the answer. But it is also a story about a single, deceptively ordinary instrument, and about the 10,000 feet of empty air that may have separated what a crew believed from where they truly were. To understand Flight 389, you first have to understand the machine, because in the summer of 1965, the Boeing 727 was still a very new thing in the sky, and this particular aeroplane was newer than almost any of them. The 727 had entered commercial service only in February of 1964. A little over a year and a half before the accident, it was a sleek, fast, three-engined jet, instantly recognizable by the trio of engines clustered at its tail and the tall T-shaped tail fin rising above them, and it represented the cutting edge of the jet age as it reached America's shorter domestic routes. Airlines loved it, passengers loved it, and Boeing was selling them as fast as it could build them. United Air Lines alone had ordered nearly 250 of the type. The 727 was, in short, a triumph, a modern, capable, reliable workhorse that would go on to become one of the best-selling airliners in history. But in August of 1965, it had not yet suffered a single fatal accident. Not one had ever been lost. That record was about to end. The aircraft that would end it bore the registration November 7036 uniform, and it was almost impossibly young. It had made its first flight only on the 18th of May, 1965, and had been delivered to United on the 3rd of June, which meant that on the night it crashed, it had been carrying passengers for a grand total of about 2.5 months. In its entire life, it had flown just 138 flights. It was powered by 3 Pratt & Whitney turbofan engines. It had been reporting no significant mechanical problems, and it was, by every measure available, a healthy, modern, well-maintained aeroplane. Whatever brought it down, it was not an old or worn-out machine failing at the end of a long career. This was a nearly new jet, and it flew into the lake as though nothing at all were the matter. The people entrusted with November 7036 uniform that evening were, likewise, not novices, though there is one detail in their records that would later take on a certain weight. In command was Captain Melville Towle, 42 years old, a veteran who had been flying for United since early 1946, nearly 20 years. He had flown a succession of the airline's aircraft over the decades, the Douglas DC-3, the DC-4, the Vickers Viscount, and had accumulated a formidable total of more than 17,000 flying hours. He was, without question, a deeply experienced airman. But he was also relatively new to this specific aircraft type. Of those 17,000 hours, only 59 had been logged as a captain on the Boeing 727, and a good portion of even those had been training flights. He knew how to fly. He was still, in a sense, getting to know how to fly this. Beside him sat the first officer, Roger Whitesell, 34, who had qualified as a co-pilot on the 727 the previous November and had some 363 hours on the type. And behind them, at the flight engineers panel, was the second officer, Morris Femmer, just 26 years old, the most junior member of the crew, responsible for monitoring the aircraft's systems. All three had been on duty for only about 2.5 hours since their last rest. This was not a fatigued crew at the end of a brutal shift, but a rested one, early in its working evening. There was, on the face of it, nothing about these three men to suggest that they were about to fly a perfectly good aeroplane into a lake. The flight itself was one of the most routine imaginable. Flight 389 was a scheduled service from LaGuardia Airport in New York to O'Hare International Airport in Chicago, a well-worn domestic hop of some 733 miles that United's crews flew day in and day out. On the evening of the 16th of August, the 727 lifted off from LaGuardia, carrying 24 passengers and its 6 crew, climbed to a cruising altitude of 35,000 feet, and settled into the smooth, uneventful business of a jet-age evening flight across the American Midwest. The crew checked in with air traffic control along the way, reaching their cruising level without incident. Everything, by every account and every scrap of recorded communication, was completely normal. The passengers in the cabin behind would have had no reason to feel anything but the ordinary calm of a night flight nearing its end. The seatbelt sign, perhaps, the gentle sensation of descent, the lights of the approaching city somewhere ahead in the dark. As the aircraft neared Chicago, it began its descent from cruising altitude toward the airport, and here the flight passed into the hands of the approach controllers, who would guide it down through the busy airspace around O'Hare. The controllers issued the aeroplane a series of descent clearances, stepping it down through the sky toward the altitude from which it would begin its final approach. And it was somewhere in the middle of this ordinary, nightly ritual, the routine, choreographed descent, that ends thousands of flights safely every single day, that something went quietly and catastrophically wrong. Nothing dramatic, nothing anyone said aloud, just an aeroplane that kept going down when it should have stopped. To understand what most likely happened next, we have to stop and look closely at one small dial on the instrument panel, because the leading theory of this entire disaster rests on it. That dial is the altimeter, the instrument that tells a pilot how high the aircraft is above sea level, and the particular kind of altimeter fitted to November 7036 uniform was of a design that, by 1965, was already under serious suspicion, a design called the three-pointer altimeter. The idea behind the three-pointer altimeter was to display altitude the way a clock displays time, using 3 separate needles of different lengths rotating around a single dial, marked from 0 to 9. One needle, the longest, indicated hundreds of feet, sweeping all the way around for each 1,000 feet of altitude. A second, shorter needle indicated thousands of feet, and a third, shortest needle, sometimes with a small marker on it, indicated tens of thousands of feet. To read your altitude, you had to take in all 3 needles at once and mentally assemble them into a single number, exactly as you read the hour, minute, and second hands of a clock. At 16,000 feet, the needles sat in one arrangement, at 6,000 feet in another. In principle, it was perfectly logical. In practice, it was a trap. The problem was that the 3 needles could be genuinely difficult to tell apart at a glance, especially the ones indicating thousands and tens of thousands of feet, which were similar in appearance and close together on the dial. A pilot scanning the instrument quickly in a dimly lit cockpit, with dozens of other things demanding attention, could all too easily misread which needle was which, and the most dangerous misreading of all was to confuse the 10,000s needle, so that an altitude of 6,000 feet was read as 16,000 feet, or 26,000 as 16. A slip of exactly 10,000 feet, and this was not a theoretical concern dreamed up after the fact. It had already happened repeatedly in aviation history. Pilots had flown perfectly serviceable aircraft into the ground because they believed sincerely and completely that they were 10,000 feet higher than they actually were. How serious was this flaw? Serious enough that, only months before Flight 389 went into the lake, the United States Naval Research Laboratory had published a formal study of the problem. And its findings were damning. The researchers had tested 4 different designs of altimeter, comparing how quickly and how accurately pilots could read each one. The 3-pointer design finished dead last. It was misread, the study found, nearly 8 times more often than the best-performing design tested, and it took pilots measurably longer to work out the correct reading even when they got it right. In other words, the very instrument that told a pilot the single most safety-critical number in the entire cockpit, how high am I above the ground, was, in the 3-pointer configuration, the one most likely to lie to him, and the slowest to be understood. The study was a warning, published in January of 1965. Flight 389 crashed that August. The 3-pointer altimeter would not be formally banned for decades, but its reputation was already, by the time of this accident, thoroughly and deservedly poor. This, then, is the instrument at the heart of the mystery, and the theory that the investigators would eventually settle on as the most likely explanation for why a healthy jet flew a calm, controlled descent straight into a lake. The descent toward Chicago proceeded, and the controllers stepped the aircraft down. At a certain point, Flight 389 was cleared to descend to and maintain 6,000 feet, an altitude comfortably above the terrain and above the surface of Lake Michigan, which lies at only 577 feet above sea level. 6,000 feet was a safe, ordinary altitude at which to level off and continue toward the airport. The crew acknowledged the clearance. And then, according to the radar data that would later become the investigation's most important surviving evidence, the aeroplane did something that made no sense at all, unless you understand the altimeter. It kept descending, smoothly, steadily, at a constant rate of about 2,000 feet per minute, a perfectly normal, gentle rate of descent. The 727 continued straight down through 6,000 feet, as though the clearance had never been given, as though the crew fully intended to keep going. There was no level off, no reduction in the rate of descent, no hesitation. The aeroplane behaved exactly as a well-flown aircraft behaves when its pilots are deliberately, calmly descending toward a much lower target. And this is the crucial, chilling detail. The descent was not out of control. It was controlled. Whoever was flying that aeroplane was flying it smoothly and deliberately downward, which means that they believed they had a great deal more altitude to lose than they actually did. The radar analysis made the horror of it precise. By the time the controllers issued that 6,000-foot clearance, and the captain acknowledged it, the aircraft was, in reality, already far below 6,000 feet, already down somewhere between just 1,000 and 2,500 feet above the water, and still descending. If the crew's altimeters were being misread by 10,000 feet, then everything falls into place with terrible clarity. When their instruments appeared to show 16,000 feet, they were actually at 6,000. When they believed they were passing through, say, 11,000 feet with plenty of room to spare, they were, in fact, skimming down through just 1,000 feet above a black and featureless lake. They thought they had miles of sky beneath them. They had seconds. And here the night itself delivered the final, fatal ingredient, because everything about the darkness over Lake Michigan conspired to hide the truth from the crew until it was too late. On a clear day, or over land dotted with lights, a pilot has a wealth of visual cues to the aircraft's true height. The ground rushing up, the growing size of buildings and roads, the horizon. But Flight 389 was descending at night, over water, and the conditions were, in the words of another pilot flying nearby, fuzzy and unclear. The captain of a Boeing 707 traveling the same route about 30 miles behind Flight 389 would later report that his own aircraft had been in cloud during the descent until they broke out into clear air only at around 8,000 to 10,000 feet, and that once below the cloud, the only lights visible anywhere were the distant lights of the shoreline off to one side. Ahead and below, over the open water of the lake, there was nothing. No lights, no horizon, no texture, just a wall of featureless black that gave a descending pilot no visual clue whatsoever as to how close the surface really was. This is a phenomenon aviation knows and fears. The black hole effect, in which a pilot flying toward a dark, featureless area at night is deprived of the normal visual cues to altitude and distance, and can descend far lower than intended without any sense of danger. Over the void of Lake Michigan on that August night, a crew who already believed, because of their altimeters, that they had thousands of feet in hand would have had absolutely nothing outside the windscreen to contradict that belief. No rising ground, no looming surface, no glittering approach of the water. Just darkness and the smooth, calm, deliberate descent continuing, second by second, toward a surface that none of them could see and none of them knew was there. At approximately 21 minutes past 9 in the evening, Flight 389 struck the surface of Lake Michigan at a speed of around 200 knots, some 20 miles offshore. On the beaches of Chicago's North Shore, people saw it happen without understanding what they were seeing. A lifeguard at the North Avenue Beach House reported glimpsing an orange flash on the horizon far out over the water, and then, about 3 seconds later, hearing a distant thundering roar roll in across the lake. Reports began flooding in to the police and the Coast Guard from all along the north side and the North Shore, a flash, a sound, something terrible out on the dark water, but there was nothing anyone on shore could do. The aeroplane was gone and everyone aboard it with it, in an instant, on what had been, until that instant, an utterly ordinary night flight home. It is worth pausing before we follow the investigators down into the wreckage to remember that this was not merely the loss of an aeroplane, but the loss of 30 human beings on an ordinary Monday evening. 24 passengers had boarded Flight 389 at LaGuardia, expecting nothing more remarkable than a couple of hours in the air, and a late arrival in Chicago. People going home, people traveling for work, people flying to see family, ordinary travelers on an ordinary route, who had every reason to expect to sleep in their own beds or their hotel rooms that night. With them were 6 crew, the 3 pilots, and 3 others working the cabin, all simply doing their jobs on a routine rotation. None of them, as far as the evidence can tell us, ever had a moment's warning. There was no terror in the cabin, no long descent into panic, no time to be afraid. And while that is, in its way, a small mercy, it is also part of what makes the accident so haunting. 30 people were alive and calm and expecting to land, and then, in a single instant over the dark water, they were not. On the shore, the families and colleagues waiting for a flight from New York would learn, over the coming hours, that it was not going to arrive. The response came quickly, but there was never any hope of a rescue. The Coast Guard mobilized, and skin divers assembled at the North Shore Yacht Club in Highland Park, which became an informal base for the search. Boats went out onto the dark lake. The area was combed for hours. But a jetliner striking water at 200 knots does not leave survivors, and the search turned up no one alive. What it turned up instead was wreckage, the shattered remains of a nearly new Boeing 727, scattered across the bed of Lake Michigan in muddy water some 250 feet deep. Within hours, investigators from the Civil Aeronautics Board, the body responsible at that time for investigating American air disasters, were on the scene and beginning the grim work of trying to understand what had happened. From the very start, they faced a profound handicap, one that would ultimately doom the investigation to end in a question mark. The single most valuable piece of evidence in any crash investigation is the flight data recorder, the armored black box that continuously records the aircraft's altitude, speed, heading, and other key parameters, and which can reconstruct an aeroplane's final moments with a precision no witness can match. Flight 389 had a flight data recorder aboard, and the investigators could not get the data from it. The recorder had come apart in the violence of the impact and its descent to the lake bed. Searchers managed to recover the outer casing of the device, but the internal mechanism, the part that actually held the recording, was never found. It was somewhere out there in the mud and the dark, at the bottom of Lake Michigan, and it was lost. With it went the one source that could have told the investigators, beyond all doubt, exactly what the aircraft's instruments had been indicating in those final minutes. The most important witness to the disaster had sunk beyond reach. There is a deeper tragedy buried in that loss, one that extends beyond this single crash. The 1960s were the early years of the flight data recorder as a routine safety tool, And the whole promise of the device was that it would end exactly this kind of uncertainty, that never again would investigators have to guess at an aircraft's final moments, because the black box would simply tell them. Flight 389 was a cruel demonstration of the limits of that promise. The recorder had done its job faithfully right up until the impact. It had presumably captured the very data that would have answered every question. But a recorder is only useful if it can be found and read, and the technology of the era, the physical recording medium, the casing, the way it was mounted, was not robust enough to guarantee survival and recovery from a high-speed impact into deep, muddy water. The answer to the mystery of Flight 389 may well have existed in physical form for a few moments at the bottom of Lake Michigan before it was lost in the silt. The investigators knew, with some anguish, that the thing they most needed was down there in the dark, and that they could not reach it. In the decades since, flight recorders have been made vastly more survivable and easier to locate, precisely so that cases like this one, a crash rendered permanently unsolvable by an unrecoverable recorder, would become rarer. Flight 389 is in part a monument to why that work mattered. Deprived of the recorder, the investigators did what investigators do. They worked methodically through every possible explanation, trying to eliminate what they could and narrow down what remained. And one by one, the alternative theories fell away. Had there been a mechanical failure? They examined the recovered wreckage exhaustively for any sign of a malfunction that could have caused the crash, and found none. Had something been ejected through the engine cowlings, a catastrophic engine failure flinging debris? The recovered engine structure showed no evidence of it. Had there been a mid-air collision or a near miss that forced the aircraft into a fatal maneuver? There were no components of any other aircraft in the recovered wreckage. No other aircraft had been reported missing, and there was no known conflicting traffic in the area at the time. Had the crew reported any difficulty, any emergency, any problem whatsoever? A careful review of all the air traffic control communications revealed nothing. No distress, no irregularity, no hint of trouble in any transmission the crew made. Right up to the captain's final, routine acknowledgement of the 6,000-foot clearance. Everything the crew said and did was consistent with a completely normal flight. The aeroplane had, to all appearances, been working perfectly, flown by a crew who gave no indication that anything was wrong, and it had simply descended into the lake. When every mechanical and external explanation had been ruled out, the investigators were left staring at the same impossible fact from which we started. A healthy jet, on a calm and controlled descent, had flown straight into the water without anyone aboard apparently realizing the danger. And the only explanation that could account for all of it, the smoothness of the descent, the absence of any alarm, the crew's evident belief that everything was fine, was that the pilots had thought they were somewhere they were not. Specifically, that they had been reading their altimeters as showing an altitude 10,000 feet higher than the aircraft's true height. It fit every piece of the evidence. It matched the known, documented, laboratory-confirmed weakness of the three-pointer altimeter. It explained the untroubled, deliberate descent of a crew who believed they had thousands of feet still to give. It was, the investigators concluded, the most likely explanation. But most likely is not proven. And here the investigation ran into the hard limit imposed by that lost recorder. Because the flight data recorder was never recovered, the altimeter theory could never be confirmed. It was, and remains, an inference, a deeply compelling one, supported by the radar data, by the elimination of every alternative, and by the well-established treachery of the instrument in question, but an inference all the same. No one could prove what the crew's altimeters had been showing, because the device that recorded it was lost. No one could prove what the crew had believed, because the crew had not survived to say, and there was no cockpit voice recorder of the kind that would later become standard to preserve their words. The investigators had a theory that fit the facts better than any other, but they did not have the one piece of evidence that would have turned that theory into a certainty. And so, in its final report, the Civil Aeronautics Board wrote the words that make this crash so uniquely unsettling. On the question of probable cause, the section of an accident report where investigators state, as definitively as they can, what brought an aircraft down, the board declined to name a cause at all. It wrote instead that it was unable to determine the reason for the aircraft not being leveled off at its assigned altitude of 6,000 feet. Not the cause was pilot error. Not the cause was an altimeter misreading. Simply, we do not know. The most likely explanation had been identified and stated, and it pointed clearly at the three-pointer altimeter and the 10,000-foot slip, but the board would not and could not close the case. Officially, the reason United Air Lines Flight 389 flew into Lake Michigan on the night of the 16th of August, 1965, has never been determined. If the altimeter theory can never be proven for Flight 389, it can at least be shown to be entirely plausible, because the exact failure it describes had already killed people, more than once, in cases where the evidence did survive to prove it. The 10,000-foot altimeter misreading was not an exotic hypothesis. It was a known killer with a documented history. The first case in which a crash was firmly proven to have been caused by a pilot misreading the altimeter by 10,000 feet had occurred years earlier, in April of 1958, when a British European Airways Vickers Viscount came down outside Ayr in Scotland. Later that same year, on Christmas Eve of 1958, a Bristol Britannia crashed near Christchurch in the south of England from the same cause, and in that accident, crucially, some of the crew survived, and the surviving crew members were able to help investigators pinpoint exactly what had gone wrong. They had been 10,000 feet lower than they believed. Here was hard, first-hand confirmation that the error was real, that experienced pilots really could and did misread these instruments by a full 10,000 feet, and that the consequences were lethal. And the pattern would continue after Flight 389 as well. A couple of years later, an Iberia Airlines crash was likewise suspected of having been caused by an altimeter misreading, though, as with Flight 389, it could not be conclusively proven. The three-pointer altimeter, in other words, had a body count. Flight 389 fits seamlessly into a grim sequence of accidents in which capable crews, betrayed by a confusing instrument, flew serviceable aircraft into terrain or water in the sincere belief that they were safely high above it. Whatever the ultimate truth about Flight 389, the broader lesson of that era was heard, and it produced real and lasting change, the fundamental problem that the three-pointer altimeter was slow to read and dangerously easy to misinterpret was not in serious doubt. The Naval Research Laboratory had demonstrated it in the laboratory, and a string of accidents had demonstrated it in blood. And so, over the following years, the aviation industry moved away from the three-pointer design toward altimeters that were far harder to misread. The favored replacements combined a single moving pointer with a direct numerical readout, a counter or a drum that simply displayed the altitude as a number, the way a car's odometer displays mileage, so that a pilot no longer had to decode the positions of three similar needles under pressure, but could read the altitude directly as digits. These counterpointer and drum pointer designs had ranked at the very top of that same Naval Research Laboratory study that had placed the three-pointer at the bottom. The instrument that had most likely doomed Flight 389 and had certainly doomed others was progressively designed out of the world's cockpits and the specific trap it represented. The invisible, silent 10,000-foot lie was gradually closed off. The three-pointer altimeter would not be formally prohibited until 1998, but long before that it had become an obsolete relic, replaced across the industry by instruments that told the truth more plainly. There is a quiet irony in this, and it is worth sitting with. Flight 389 was one of the most modern aircraft in the world, a brand new jet, barely 10 weeks old, representing the leading edge of 1960s aviation technology. And yet, if the leading theory is correct, it may have been brought down by one of the oldest and most primitive pieces of equipment in its own cockpit, a clock-faced dial that asked a human being to correctly assemble three little needles into a number, at night, in the dark, with lives depending on getting it right. The jet age had raced ahead, but some of the instruments the jets carried still belonged to an earlier, more fallible era, and the gap between the two on one August night over Lake Michigan may have been exactly 10,000 feet wide. More than anything, though, United Air Lines Flight 389 endures as a mystery, and there is something about its particular kind of mystery that lingers in the mind long after the technical details have faded. It is not the mystery of a violent, obvious catastrophe. There was no explosion in the sky, no desperate mayday, no aeroplane wrestling with a failing machine. It is a far stranger and more haunting thing. The mystery of an aeroplane that flew calmly and competently to its own destruction, with everyone aboard, as far as anyone can tell, entirely unaware that anything was wrong. The crew did not fight for their lives, because they never knew their lives were in danger. They descended smoothly toward the water at a gentle 2,000 feet per minute, believing, most likely, that they were doing exactly the right thing, believing that the black expanse beneath them was still thousands of feet away, when in truth it was rising to meet them with every passing second. We will probably never know for certain what they saw on their instruments in those final minutes, or what passed through their minds, because the evidence that could have told us lies scattered and lost in the mud at the bottom of a lake, and the people who could have told us went down with their aeroplane. What we are left with is the most likely explanation, a compelling, well-supported, but ultimately unproven story about a confusing dial and 10,000 feet of empty air, and the enduring image of a brand-new jet gliding down through the summer darkness, its crew calm, its passengers unknowing, straight into the black water of Lake Michigan on a night when nothing, until the very last second, seemed to be wrong at all. 30 people boarded a routine evening flight from New York to Chicago on the 16th of August, 1965. None of them arrived, and 60 years later, the aviation world still cannot say, with certainty, why.